Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Shorts episode number 34. Nangus Jack. Nangus Jack was a man I discovered when doing episode 275 on Simon Fraser, the bagpiper. Nangus Jack was a well-known stockwhip maker. Nangus Jack was born John Nangus Hughes. He was of Aboriginal descent. His birth year and birthplace is unknown. He married Helen Houston on the 26th of January 1843 in Melbourne at St James's Church, which is where their children were all baptised. Helen was born in 1817 at Rothesay, Bute in Scotland. They had 6 children together, the first 4 being born in Melbourne and the younger children being born in Kilmore, Victoria. On the 20th of June 1855 in the Melbourne Argus, John is advertising his stockwhips. Nangus Jack stockwhips are to be had at my residence opposite the Independent Chapel in Oxford Street, Collingwood, or at Mackenzie and Company's Saddlers, Burke Street West. A couple of months later in the Melbourne Argus is advertising Nangus Jack's 16-strand stockwhips and youth's 8-feet thongs at Mackenzie and Company Saddlers in Burke Street West. By 1858, he had agents throughout New South Wales, including Ballarat, selling his stockwhips. On the 16th of September 1897 in the Melbourne Herald, Simon Fraser wrote into the paper to discuss the making of stockwhips and how Nangus Jack's process was by far the best. The stockwhip, how to make it. An old maker of the loud cracking throng who's left his mark on many a hide and ridden many a buck-jumper writes of the 16-footer, so dear to stockmen. The Australian stockwhip was first brought to perfection by John Nangus Hughes, or Nangus Jack as he was commonly called. He was the best maker of the large stockwhip for general use. He learnt the art himself and travelled from station to station making heavy whips used in the 1850s and later on. Some of his best whips are still in existence, which proves that his method of curing the hide must have been the best. One of his heaviest 14 strands and 16-foot long whips can be seen in the possession of Mr. John Bon at the Cathedral Hotel in Melbourne. Mr. Bon himself is an expert in the use of the stockwhip and an excellent judge. As it will be interesting to whip fanciers and makers to know how he made these whips, I will try as simply as possible to explain this method of stockwhip making. Nangus preferred a white heifer's hide to all others and cured it in the following manner. He first of all pegged out the hide, and so the sun would not get at it, sprinkled salt evenly over it. After the salt had melted into it, he spread a shovelful of ashes evenly over the hide as well. When dry, he cut the hide round off the pegs and cut off a foot of the sides, which he seldom used. He made his best whips from the centre of the hide and cut the strands on the square and about twice the width of the thickness of the hide. He always put in the belly of his whips with a nice evenly plaited 4-strand whip. His method of plaiting was different to most makers. He used a very small belly to plait over, never slipping up the strands as commonly practised by the trade. He also carefully avoided the pernicious habit of levelling the strands, which is fatal to whip wearing well. He had damped the strands and had them ready for plaiting, and he would fasten the neck to the hook and then the inside belly to the other hook behind him, just high enough for him to stride over, and then commence plaiting. By this plan he always kept the seams of the plaiting straight and pulled all the strands in evenly. As he plaited a foot or so at a time, he would roll that portion and keep on plaiting and rolling it till he finished the whip. After the whip was finished, he would give it another good rubbing from one end to the other, and then rub in some grease free from salt. After the whip was well made, the secret to putting it into use is if you want to wear well. This is the way these whips were constructed, and although I've had 40 years' experience, I have no better plan. Years ago, I came to the conclusion that a whip made in the Nangus Jack style is the best, as they can be any size or weight, and they are always to be had at a moderate price. Some say the stockwhip is not used as well as now as in the early days. This is a fallacy. I saw the best man ever using the stockwhip is now residing at Flemington. His name is D. Hassel, and anyone who would like to see a large or small whip properly used should call on him, and I will guarantee them a treat in this line.
In concluding, I may say that besides a whip being well made, a proper handle is a good deal to go with the fall. I find for whips a hickory handle is the best. Mile makes a good handle, but it's not always obtainable. The whip should always be tied close up to the handle at the keeper. Fraser could plait 16 strands of leather into a whip supple enough to pull through a 6mm auger hole. On the 19th of August 1865, in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times, it announced the death of Nangus Jack. The remains of John Nangus Hughes, otherwise known as Nangus Jack, have been found by the Yanga blacks in some back country 4 miles east from a place called Lintot Sandhills, 25 miles from the Edward River. The deceased was well known as a stockwhip maker and evidently lost his way and died from thirst when going from Mr. G.A. Mean's station to an out hut in November. About £8 and a silver watch were found on or near the deceased, which has been handed to the agent for the curator of interstate estates. It is stated that the deceased left a widow who it is believed resides in Melbourne. The remains were interred where found. And a week later, in the Police Gazette, on or about the 8th, the remains of a man, 5'5" or 6 inches high, grey hair, was found by one of the Yanga blacks in the bush, 4 miles east from Lintot Sandhills and 25 miles from the Edward River. The following property was found near the body: an order for £3 signed G.A. and P. Mean, one for 10 shillings signed P. Young, a £1 note, a sovereign, 6 shillings and 6 pence in silver, and some whips. Also a small silver watch attached to the body by a silver chain. From inquiries made by the Aboriginal police, there can be no doubt that the remains are those of John Nangus Hughes, stockwhip maker, who called into Mr. Mean's cattle station on the 29th or 30th of November and afterwards did some work for Mr. Mean at Mulpa and left with the intention of going to an outstation but was not afterwards heard of. Hughes informed Mr. Mean that he was better known as Nangus Jack, the stockwhip maker, and that his wife was living in Melbourne. It is supposed that the deceased perished for want of water. So John Nangus Hughes' death certificate states that he died in 1865 and it was registered in Balranald. Helen was only 48 when she was widowed. She lived until 1891 and she died in Oakley, Victoria, aged 74. There were some recollections of Nangus Jack and his whips. On the 28th of November 1936 in the Adelaide Advertiser, says, coming to platters of renown, Simon Fraser deserves special mention. This master craftsman had a clever teacher, the famous Nangus Jack, who did little else but plait excellent whips, selling them at stations almost all over the Commonwealth. Nangus Jack whips, what few endure, are now treasured relics. And another article on the 4th of August 1938 in the Adelaide Chronicle. Perhaps the greatest platter who ever followed the profession in Australia was Nangus Jack. This man travelled all over the country making and selling his whips. He did no other work. In fact, it is said that he had to turn work away at times. He plaited all sorts of whips, from the small buggy whip to the bullock whip, which was often 20 feet long. It took an expert to handle a 20-foot whip, but there were many whip experts amongst the teamsters of those days. Nangus Jack lived for his art, and no doubt his death was as he would have wished it. He died holding one of his own whips in his hand. On the 5th of November 1938, in the Townsville Daily Bulletin, Nangus Jack was a very good whip maker and also a good hand at making hide ropes, and in his day the whips used were much bigger than they are at the present time. Nangus Jack was Simon Fraser's mentor. He started Simon at making them, but as a whip cracker he was really no class. And then on the 8th of April 1939 in the Melbourne Argus, Mr. G.H.C. Campbell of Seymour has some interesting things to say about stock whips and their makers. Most of the information I can give you has been told me by that of a very noted whip maker, the late Simon Fraser of Mansfield, who was taught to make whips by Nangus Jack. I've heard old bushmen say that a 15-foot Nangus Jack whip was as easy to use as a present-day 10-foot one. He used to cut out his strands with a knife that he had sharpened on old steel. I understand that originally he'd been a sailor. There are only 2 Nangus Jack whips that I know of still in existence. In those days, the squatters always prided themselves on owning a Nangus Jack whip. I have a collection of stock whips, all of which, with the exception of 2, have been made by Simon Fraser. 2 of these whips he told me he'd made for 2 uncles of mine nearly 70 years ago, and I use them now sometimes. So what age must the 2 Nangus Jack whips be now? So John and Helen Hughes' children: The firstborn was John Nangus Hughes, Jr., and he was born on the 15th of December 1843 in Victoria and was baptised at St James's Church on the 31st of December 1843. When his father was found deceased, there was an ad placed in the Victorian Gazette under the Missing Friends heading on the 20th of September 1865. Information is requested respecting John Nangus Hughes, aged 22, stout and fair-haired. He's said to be living with a butcher in Dunedin, New Zealand. His father, same name, was lately found dead in the bush in New South Wales. And that's all I could find on John Nangus Hughes Jr. Even in New Zealand papers, I couldn't find any evidence of him living there, and public trees also don't have information on his death date or what happened to him after that time. Their second child, Thomas Shelley Hughes, died aged 1 year old in Melbourne. Their third child, Hannah Hughes, was born on the 6th of August 1846 and was baptised on the 25th of December 1846 at St James's. Hannah and George Primrose Watson had a son, George Samuel Woodhouse Watson, in 1887, who died at 4 years old. Hannah ended up marrying George, who was a saddler from Coburg, in 1891. She was 45 and George 47, but George died 2 years after their marriage, aged only 44. Hannah died in 1934 in Cheltenham, Victoria, aged 88. On the 6th of January 1934 in the Melbourne Age, it had a death notice. On the 2nd of January, Mrs. Hannah Watson, dearly beloved sister of Thomas Daniel Hughes and the late Mrs. Helen Golden, late William Hughes, dearly beloved aunt of Mrs. John A. Gillespie and Thomas Arthur Hughes, devoted aunt of the late Private Alfred Cecil Golden, born in Melbourne in 1846. So the fourth child was William Hughes, who was born in 1851 in Victoria, and he died on the 12th of October 1889 in Richmond, Victoria, aged only 38. The next child was Helen Hughes, who was born in 1853 in Kilmore, Victoria. She married John Alfred Golden, who was English, in Victoria in 1873. They had 2 children, a son in 1874 and a daughter in 1876. John Alfred Golden died at the age of 30 on the 24th of June 1879 of consumption or tuberculosis, only 6 years after they married, and their daughter was only 3 at the time of his death. Helen and John Golden's son, Alfred Cecil Golden, died in a railway accident aged only 43. At the time of his death, he was a soldier at the Langwarrin training camp in Gippsland. There was evidence he'd been drinking heavily, and it was surmised that he died from his head striking a train. On the 15th of August 1916, in the Melbourne Age, it announced his death. On the 12th of August, Alfred Cecil Golden accidentally killed at Langwarrin, the beloved son of Mrs. Allen and the late John Alfred Golden of South Yarra, and dearly loved nephew of Mrs. H. Watson of Symonds Street. In this death notice it says he was 41. Ellen Emma Golden was their other child, who married John Gillespie, and she lived until she was 94. On the 12th of September 1916 in the Victorian Police Gazette, it had a notice that Mrs. Helen Golden was missing from her home at 21 Surrey Road, South Yarra, since the 31st of August. 62 years of age, with a medium height and build, walks with a slight limp, usually carries a walking stick or umbrella, dressed in a black skirt, a black cape with fur trimmings around her shoulders, a black hat, black shoes with ribbon bows and black stockings. Helen died in 1919 at the age of 66. And the youngest child, Thomas Daniel Hughes, was born in 1854 at Kilmore, Victoria. He was only 11 when his father died. He married Alice Cooper in Victoria, and they had one child, Thomas Arthur Hughes, on the 30th of June 1879 in Richmond. Alice Cooper died on the 15th of March 1882, and Thomas went on to marry Mary Ann O'Brien in January 1894. Thomas was 40 and Mary 27. They had 2 children together, with one surviving infancy, Catherine Mern Hughes, who was born in February 1896 in Armidale, Victoria. Thomas was a painter, and he died on the 11th of December 1920 at East Malvern, aged 66. Mary went on to remarry in 1921, and she died in July 1951 in Victoria at the age of 83. And just a little side note, I would have loved to have found a lot more about Nangus Jack, but it seems that there's no stories online, there's no Facebook historical articles that have been made about him or any feeds or blogs. So it was quite difficult to piece together just the basics. But I do hope you enjoyed it, and I feel that I've at least let people know in 2026 about Nangus Jack and how important he was to the early station owners in our colonies.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.